wake up, bro. I'm fucking tired out.
Come on, big teats, come on.
Let's see who can titty dance better. Oh, fuck. Yours are actually pretty big, dude.
You think? I don't know if I should be complimented or insulted. Dang, your chest is actually pretty
bro. Alright.
Ready?
Yeah.
What is up, guys? Marcellus Williams, aka TheSwolefessor, here to educate you on health and social well-being. Here again with Brendan Teets. No introduction needed.
What's up, guys?
I just said no introduction needed.
What's up, guys? I'm Brendan Teets. This guy's coach. Alright, go.
Alright, guys. So today we're pretty much going to be talking about variation work. We've been talking about that quite a bit on this channel lately, but today we're going to get very specific with how you guys can determine what variations you may need to pick.
And this is some shit no one's talked about because we're going to go in depth here, so stay tuned. This isn't just like, do something you're weak at. We're going to go in depth.
Yeah, we're going to explain exactly, okay, if this is your specific weakness, this 9 times out of 10 more than likely is the variation you need to utilize to help fix that weakness. So we're going to get right into it. So pretty much, guys, well, actually, you know, I'm going to let you go ahead and start off with pretty much why we do variations to begin with.
So really the only time we want to do variation is either one, to get out a repetitive movement, which is actually the lesser of the two reasons why we do this. So if we just don't want to overuse any movement pattern, that's how you build up injury. But really the main reason we would do variation is to build up a muscular weak point and or a strength pattern weak points, like an actual movement deviation we're trying to fix. But usually, especially when we're using variation, it's often going to fall in like a secondary, tertiary base day, you know, like something like a high bar or front squat for volume to really build up a weaker muscle group to have carryover to the main three. So for instance, if someone finds that their back is really giving out in a squat, so that's something Marcellus deals with, we like high bar for him because it really challenges that thoracic extension demand in the squat pattern. So simply put, choosing a variation that's going to build up a muscular weak point that manifests in your big three.
Yep, absolutely. And on top of that, guys, is also if you're just dealing with things as far as like their movement patterns, for example, Brendan has a lot of like extension. Me, I just naturally have way more flexion. So working on things like the high bar squat, working on the front squat, things that are going to force me to keep my lower back in extension and stay more upright, as we've discussed before, that's going to be beneficial to me. So you basically want to look at, in a sense, not even just your weaknesses, you can even look at like what positions you tend to be stronger in and then try to work the opposite position. Because if you're stronger in one position, then more than likely you're going to be weaker in the opposite position of that.
Yeah, so like a good example of that's going to be like some people bias external rotation in their squat like me. My knees go way out to the sides when I squat. I have natural retroversion in my hips, meaning they are kind of externally rotated by nature, and so when I squat, I'm very externally rotated. You'll see some trainees who are very anteverted in their hips, very knee forward. So I'm going to benefit, like when I do my high bar squats, I'm often thinking about loading into the quads, the adductors, and trying to get those to fire. As where when he's doing his high bar squats, he's trying to bias extension in his back. That for me, I get nothing out of that because I'm naturally so extended. So when we're looking at movement, we can see what position someone biases and try to choose their variations around kind of the position they do not bias to build up that weak point. Otherwise, that discrepancy gets large, and that's where you see a lot of injuries and bad movement build up in technique as well.
Yeah, and a lot of people, guys, they're so quick to say, like, why not fix these issues with the count-specific lift? And exactly, you can't.
If it's not a cueing issue, you can't.
Exactly, that's the thing. And there's a difference between like, okay, you've just never been taught proper technique on a movement, so that's why you're not in a good position, versus you have a muscular imbalance or weaknesses that literally keeps you from getting into proper position. And more often than not, if we're doing that specific movement pattern over and over, we're gonna make the issues worse, not better. If you're, for me, for example, with the low bar squat, if I continue to just try to like fix it with that issue, it's only going to cause more flexion for me because that's the position it naturally puts me in. So why would I continue to do that when my issue is that I'm already flexing too hard and to get more into extension? And if it's a muscular weakness and the specific movement isn't building that muscular weakness up, it doesn't make any sense to continue to do.
No, not at all. I'll see this all the time. I'll get clients who come to me. A deadlift is a common one. Yeah. They don't know how to utilize their glutes in the deadlift early on, and that's probably a cueing issue.
Exactly.
And then they spend like 3 years building up their deadlift with really shit hip extension.
Yeah.
They rely on their back going into flexion, and then they re-extend with the back, and their glutes get very little contraction or activity during their deadlift, and then it actually creates that muscular imbalance. So this can be created. It can be kind of something that someone's naturally just biased towards due to their anatomy or whatever. Yeah. There can be 1,000 reasons around it, But if it is a true weakness by from a muscular standpoint, we got to actually train in a different pattern because you can't just cue out of it. Liam comes to mind, my client.
Yeah.
I have a client named Liam. When he extends his hips in the deadlift, you can see he actually never gets full hip extension, and his back is trying to extend for him. And sometimes he actually won't even actually fully lock out the deadlift. His hips kind of hang behind. And so we're giving him a lot of hip thrusts, a lot of tempo sumo deadlifts, things where we can get those glutes more under him and actually performing like that hip extension.
And then oftentimes, guys, what's cool about like variation work versus just general accessory work, which we'll get more into that later, is that you're getting kind of like a 2-1-for-1 deal. Yeah, you're working on those positions that you're not strong in, but you're once again also working on those muscular like weaknesses and balances. For me, the sumo deadlift is a great example for that. It literally is forcing me to work on keeping my lower back in that more neutral extended position, but I'm also working on like my muscular weak points like my glutes, my hamstrings, things that I just like, because I'm very quad dominant, like both in my squat and then even like with my conventional deadlift, like oftentimes my glutes aren't firing off the way that I want them to. So even though, yeah, we can work on like, mobility, pre-activation, and just general cueing, it gets to a point where I just need to get my glutes stronger. So the sumo deadlift is helping me with doing that.
And by anatomy, he literally can't get into a neutral back deadlift position on his conventional deadlift. That's where the sumo clears up that hip capsule space and he's allowed to get into it. And I know some people are going to think you can just fix that by anatomy. You can't. I've been coaching many years, guys, since 2014. I've seen all sorts of like anatomy anomalies come to me, and he's one of them. And so we use that sumo to kind of get out of that flex state, not just to even train the hips, but to even just get his back out of always being like this when he pulls, just to kind of give the spine a break and get everything working the way we want it to work. That kind of brings us into the next part. You want to kind of explain some of the variations we have in your programming?
Guys, so for right now, so we already talked about how like
high bar
and then the sumo deadlift for me, which is on my volume variation day. But another example is going to be, which you guys actually just saw in my last video, is that I actually have max grip bench press after my comp bench press on my higher intensity day for bench press. And the reason for that is for one, for years, guys, I've been benching like close grip, like even closer to where I'm at now. Right now I'm currently ring finger, so my triceps are getting a whole lot of work. I'm working through a very long range of motion. So from using the max grip bench press, one, I just get a different type of activation in my pecs, which is just good for, once again, muscular imbalances. And then two, that shorter range of motion just gets me out of my usual movement pattern, which helps prevent overuse injuries. The shorter range of motion is a little bit less taxing and fatigue on me as a whole. So that's just another example of how like I'm going with the movement or the variation of the movement that's very opposite to what I usually do.
And he's actually weaker in a wide grip bench press,
much
where other
weaker.
people are actually much stronger in that. And so another thing you can do to figure this out at home is do things you're kind of weak at. I don't want to say just rely on that. We're going to go over some rules a little bit later as how you can design or pick your variations on the big three to do on your secondary and tertiary days. But oftentimes a good rule of thumb is just do things you really suck at. And I think that especially comes to mind with the big three and very close variants. So on the bench press, if you're really bad at max grip with bench, it actually might be something that helps carry over to your main bench press. Likewise, someone like me who I bench really wide naturally, and even by my anatomy due to my clavicle length, my broadness, it actually doesn't look that wide on me. But if I go close grip, I'm so weak close grip. And so in my training, oftentimes I'm doing close grip bench press or longer ranges of motion to get that extra stimulus in. I think touching on your high bar too and the sumo, something you have to understand when you're performing these exercises or when you're doing these variations, which he touched on I think in a couple of videos ago, is you want to do these with the thought in mind of like what you want to happen in your body, what your weakness is. So if you just go and pull your sumo deadlift and your back is rounding over like a dog taking a shit, it's not going to have much carryover. It's going to be the same thing as you doing the conventional.
Which is why when I do my sumo deadlift, I'm very like, and I'm focused on this with my conventional as well, but I'm really extra focused on tensioning and maintaining that position. I want my back staying the exact same position from the moment I pull the slack out of the bar all the way through. When I'm doing my high bar squat, I'm really fighting to keep that upper back tight, keep that lower back neutral, and stay in position. And then even with another example is it doesn't even always have to necessarily be like the opposite. Like for example, I'm close grip, so I go wider on like my intensity day. On my volume bench press day, one of my main variation other than my comp specific bench work is actually like just a longer pause. And that's because an issue that I have sometimes is when I'm at the very top, like before I start learning to the eccentric, I'm very tight. I have a whole lot of tension, but sometimes I have a tendency of losing a lot of that and letting it sink into my chest a little bit. And oftentimes I'll lose driving force off my chest. So that longer pause is forcing me to have to maintain that position for longer, as well as press off my chest with more power, because that's the thing. A lot of people, they'll get to a sticking point or they'll burn out and they'll assume, oh, I need more tricep work. But but where is that issue starting with? You're weaker off your chest. So that's just another example of like, I'm bad sometimes at pushing off my chest and for pauses.
And for myself, I can pause all day because I'm extremely stable and slow in my bench press.
Yeah.
So a pause actually doesn't really affect my strength in the bench hardly at all. I can almost bench press my max with like a 2 or 3 second pause. What really matters for me is just staying in position.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of like the opposite. I can pause really long and still work with close to my same working weights.
Yeah.
So wouldn't it make sense to give me a long pause variation? And I think the biggest issue I see with people choosing variants is they just go by what someone else is doing
It's
or what looks
random.
cool, or it's just random.
You have to have a why for everything that you're doing with your program, because especially something like variation, because there's a lot of you where you may be doing 2 or 3 variations that you actually don't need, which is something else you kind of want to touch on. Is like, you can go too far with this. In the same way, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, comp specific all year long. There's extremes of that too. Like, they go to the opposite direction where like it's
too
just
much variation.
West
side comes to mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Different exercise every time you go into the gym.
And we're gonna be doing a video over that, guys, over like why that's not optimal. But you shouldn't be like, 12, 10, 8 weeks out from a meet and still doing way more variation than you're doing comp specific work. That makes no sense at all.
My girlfriend Kristen right now, she's doing almost no variation. The only variant she's doing is conventional deadlift for volume, and that's really just to avoid overuse in her hips.
Yeah.
Other than that, everything's comp specific, and she's still 12 weeks out from the meet, so a good far way out.
Yeah.
We're actually all competing on the same day, December 8th. And it's funny because me and him have a good bit of variation right now. Kristen has like none because it's not needed for her. For us right now, for me, especially being injury prone, it's needed for me, get out repetitive movement. For him, it's more muscular weaknesses we're working on. So there's different reasons. And I think the last thing we can finish off this video is just kind of going over some rules as to how to select them. I think the first one's always going to be get out of repetitive movement and get into longer ranges of motion, because I kind of look at those things as hand in hand. Deep in the off season, people are on my channel too, or who have seen my channel, I've talked about this on the volume video before, but deep in the off season, I like longer ranges of motion and just building more muscle. So this is something that just, even if you aren't weak in a close grip bench, just to overload with like more volume and more time under tension and just more total workload and building some muscle to support your system when you get back to that comp specific stuff. I like getting a lot of like longer range of motion, talking about Larson press or something like that, instead of getting into your usual arch. So that's going to be kind of the first rule.
Rule number 2, guys, is definitely going to be do what you're bad at, as Brendan said. Find like what you tend to be strongest at. Like in my case, like, I'm stronger in flex position, so I need to work on extension. Or if I'm stronger with a closer grip, I need to work on a wider grip. Or Brendan's like literally the exact opposite. He's really good with external rotation, so he needs to work more on being a little bit more like internally rotated. So work on like whatever you're really strong at. Work on the opposite of it.
And the third rule is going to be just to utilize variations that might actually help with technical cueing and or like movement deviations. So usually speaking, like 90% of the time, I like to have my clients get cued into the movement. But every once in a while, especially with someone who maybe is used to dive bombing their squats, or someone who has a hard time staying like in a certain position when they pull in the sumo deadlift, I might do things like a tempo squats or a tempo sumo deadlift or a variant like that to actually cue certain positions, slow it down so they can think about what positions they're putting their body into, and then to actually spend a ton of time in that position and just overload that with a ton of work and volume and tension in those greater ranges of motion. Anyone who follows me knows I love tempo sumo deadlifts, working on an exaggerated hip position, very upright torso, keeping the back tight, and it's a great way to strengthen kind of an extreme position that will have carryover later on to your main lift. Now, that's not to say everyone needs to do that. If your lifts are pretty technically sound, cueing can go a long way. But if you're someone who's really new especially, this can reinforce amazing habits because you get so much workload into that.
Or if we're trying to like just readjust those habits, maybe just doing a pause squat versus something like that. Like there's different varying degrees that you can do your variation work, and that's why it's very specific.
Yep, and that's pretty much it. Now we do want to talk about in future videos, which will probably start the first video on my channel. We want to go over accessory work because it's very similar rules to this, but it's a little bit even more broken down, especially because we're getting into isolating body parts. So that's going to be a series we're starting soon up on. For the first video will be on my channel, and then the next video on his.
Yeah, guys. So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. So if you aren't already, which you should be, make sure you subscribe to Brendan. That's it for the video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, go ahead and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you did. If not, leave a comment down below. Let me know what I or Brendan can do to get better. Like the video, share, subscribe. Keep it simple, specific, scientific.
See you guys later.
Catch y'all later.